Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Craig Bates, Managing Director and President of TQCSI, and I welcome you to this webinar on the process for achieving certification to FSSC 22000 from ISO 22000. We're in Australia at the moment, heading up towards summer. I usually talk quickly, so I'll try and talk a little slower because we have people from all over the world attending this webinar this afternoon. For those who don't know, TQCSI is the largest Australian certification body accredited by JASANS, and we have been the largest in food safety since HACCP and ISO 22000 were first published. And we certify clients to the HACCP code, to ISO 22000 and to FSSC 22000. As I said, my name is Craig Bates. As we're going through this PowerPoint presentation, and I will talk to each of the slides. If you have any questions, please just chop them in the chat box and I'll try and answer them for you. Otherwise, if you keep your microphones muted, the presentation will go a little bit more smoothly. What we want to discuss this afternoon are the new ISO 22000-2018 requirements, and on top of that, the new FSSC 22000 version 5 requirements. We'll then discuss what's required to transition from ISO 22000-2018 to the FSSC 22000 version 5. We'll also then talk about hazard control plans, food defence plan, food fraud vulnerability plan, allergen plans, and the environmental monitoring plan. So we obviously won't talk about each one of these in too much detail, but it'll give us an opportunity just to embrace what's required of each of the new requirements for 22000, and then we can talk elsewhere about how to enact each one. So as way of introduction, the ISO 22000-2018 version really is an excellent standard but with some new requirements over its predecessor. And FSSC 22000, as many as you would know, is becoming increasingly required by major customers throughout the world. And that's because it's a GFSI recognised scheme. We believe that FSSC 22000 is the best GFSI option, mainly because it's a management system. It's based on a management system ethos, whereas the other schemes are different. And so in a management system ethos, we know what the outcomes are, and it's how the company best delivers those outcomes the way it wants. The version 5 of FSSC 22000 reflects all that's required of ISO 22000-2018, but with greater requirements. And those greater requirements are predominantly risk assessment of potential threats, be they the intentional adulteration of food, either through economic or ideological requirements or means, allergens, and environmental monitoring. So let's talk about ISO 22000 specifically, and the new 2018 version of ISO 22000. First of all, like all management system standards from ISO, it's based on the higher level structure, which means that organisational context, risks and opportunity, and objectives and targets are embedded into this risk-based approach to food safety, just like all the other standards are. And therefore, because it's a higher level structure format, it means it can be easily integrated into other management system standards that you may pursue, like ISO 9001 for quality, or ISO 14001 for environmental, or ISO 45001 for safety. This risk-based approach is at the core of all management system standards, and obviously with this new food safety standard. There are greater regulatory and client considerations, not requirements, but you need to ensure that you are meeting both your regulatory requirements and the requirements of the clients that you service. One of the main changes with the new ISO 22000 is that the terminology for the HACCP plans, or then we knew them as OPRP CCP plans, has changed to the hazard control plans. I think ISO may have realised that there was confusion in the marketplace because the names of the plans have been changing. So now, regardless if it's HACCP or OPRP, CCP, we call them all hazard control plans now, because they really are about identifying the hazards and implementing controls to ensure the safety of food. The other very significant change with the new standard is that there is no decision tree to determine whether a hazard should be addressed through an OPRP or a CCP. That risk assessment process now must be determined by the client. And that's where a lot of people, a lot of companies sometimes need some help to identify. Associated with those OPRPs and CCPs now is that OPRPs are addressed, or at least they are monitored through action criteria. So the term action criteria has been introduced, whereas CCPs still have critical limits. Verification includes the effectiveness of the PRPs. So there are many prerequisite programs that are relevant to your business when you are implementing a food safety management system. And when we're talking about verification of the food safety management system as a whole, we need to ensure we also address the effectiveness of the PRPs. And in that process, identifying whether there is impartiality in the person who is verifying the effectiveness. And some management review inputs have changed. So there's a little bit more requirements in your agenda for management review meetings. So that's it in a nutshell for ISO 22000-2018. It really boils down to the hazard control plans and the new risk assessment process to determine whether hazards are to be addressed through an OPRP or a CCP. So now we'll look at the new FSSC 22000 version 5 requirements. First of all, why have we got a new version? Because the FSSC 22000, or I should say the foundation, are reacting to new requirements for GFSI. So the GFSI has put out some new requirements, and each of the schemes that's within the GFSI have to comply, and that means that we now have a version 5 of FSSC 22000, which will come into force from the 1st of January 2020. FSSC 22000 is based on ISO 22000-2018. So that's another one of the main reasons it changed to version 5. Went from the 2005 version to the 2018 version. And therefore, of course, clients must have hazard control plans within their system, within their food safety management system. There are some specific legal requirements for labelling. Essentially, that means that companies must comply with the law in the country where they are producing food and where they are selling it. But other significant requirements of the new version 5 is that a food defence plan must be in place based on the threat analysis. We're going to talk about food defence plans and food fraud plans in a minute. But now, to achieve version 5, companies must have a food defence plan, and they must have a food fraud vulnerability, or some people call it a mitigation plan, also based on a threat analysis. Moreover, there now must be a documented allergen management plan and a documented environmental monitoring plan. We'll talk about those in a little while. Many of you would realise that the new FSSC 22000 scheme documents have changed with this new version 5, and they now consist of one set of documents but 6 parts. And as you can see, scheme overview, the one that's really important for the clients is part 2, requirements for organisations to be audited, and then there's some rules for certification bodies and the like. Part 3, requirements for certification process, part 4, requirements for the certification bodies, part 5, requirements for accreditation bodies, and part 6, requirements for training organisations. And then there's some appendices, definitions and references. In fact, there's 7 separate annexes as well that go with this documentation. But the main one I said that's relevant to organisations pursuing certification is part 2. And those documents are freely available from the website there, FSSC 22000's own website. So what's involved in transitioning from ISO 22000, the 2018 version, to the version 5 of FSSC 22000? Well, if you have ISO 22000 in place now, you'll need to comply with the 2018 version by 2021 anyway, and you will have had to embrace the new terminology of hazard control plans. But also, the FSSC 22000 series of documents also requires clients to comply with the Sector Prerequisite Program. We call it PRP for short. So there are specific sector PRPs, we'll look at those in a second, but if you're in that particular sector, you must comply fully with those PRPs. And then there's some additional requirements specifically for FSSC as well. Let's look at those PRPs. The sector-specific PRPs that are in place at the moment is ISO 22002 Part 1, food manufacturing. So that's the main one. That's the one that's most common, food manufacturing prerequisite program. Part 2 is catering, relatively new. Part 3 is farming. Part 4 is food packaging manufacturing. Part 5 is feed and animal food production. And another standard, PAS 222, is actually manufacturing of food and feed for animals. And finally, the NTA 8059 for transport and storage. So whatever sector you're in within those sectors that are listed, you will need to comply with the relevant prerequisite program. Now, let's talk about hazard control plans. As I said, that's a new terminology for what we used to call hazard plans or OPRP/CCP plans. What's required in a hazard control plan? Well, there's still an information worksheet. What you call these documents doesn't matter, but a worksheet with all the relevant information needed to conduct the investigation and the hazard analysis of your food safety. There are some new requirements of the 2018 version that's been included in the standard that you need to consider when developing your worksheet. Then, of course, you need to establish flow diagrams for groups of common food substances that you're producing. And within those flow diagrams, you identify the various steps so that we can then identify those steps and then investigate what hazards might be pertinent to those steps. And then we call a hazard worksheet is where we identify those significant hazards in each of the steps. When I introduce a word like significant, clearly that's subjective, and that's where the risk assessment comes in. So that whole risk-based approach to management systems these days is about identifying the significance of the hazards. Then we call it an OPRP versus CCP worksheet. This is a worksheet where for those significant hazards that we've identified before, now how can we determine whether they're as OPRP or CCP, how they should be addressed or controlled through an OPRP or a CCP. And this is where you need to tailor the risk assessment for your business. No longer do we have a decision tree that we work off. And that's, in all honesty, that's the most difficult part of the exercise. And then there's the final table. We call it an OPRP-CCP table because that's where we are listing the OPRPs or the CCPs that have been developed and establishing the monitoring requirements for each and what action plans are applicable if those controls are exceeded. And then we recommend that the verification schedule stays within the hazard control plan because it's an integral part of the entire process. So the verification schedule is where you're verifying the relevant parts of your system is still applicable on an ongoing basis. That might be regularly for monitoring the critical limits, for instance, or it might be at some period of 6 or even 12 months for testing. That's all part of the verification schedule. The OPRP-CCP risk assessment that I've been talking about is used to determine if there's a significant hazard is to be addressed as an OPRP or a CCP, as I said. Formerly, it used to be a decision tree, but that's not the case any longer. And as I said, organisations must determine their own risk assessment process. That's where it gets a little difficult, particularly for small organisations. Within that risk assessment process, you must address clause 854 of ISO 22000. And that's where the standard talks about the various control measures and how you monitor them. So in this risk assessment process, you need to consider the likelihood versus the various factors of severity for the failure of control measures. And then consider the feasibility of monitoring. So some monitoring can be real time, some can't. Testing of products, etc. So that needs to all go into the mix to determine whether a hazard's going to be controlled as through an OPRP or a CCP. Now let's talk about food defence and food fraud. It's all about unintentional or intentional, it's all about intentional adulteration of food. The unintentional adulteration of food is really based on the food safety. So that's where we've always been with HACCP and the early days of ISO 22000, where we were really looking at food safety. What we now need to consider more thoroughly is when food might be intentionally adulterated. And there's two parts of that, whether it's economically driven, which is what food fraud is about, or whether it's ideologically driven, which is what food defence is about. So food defence, for instance, might be where someone may have a beef, we call it in Australia, might have a problem with a company and wants to get back at the company, and they might adulterate the food to embarrass them. In Australia, not so long ago, we had an episode where needle points or needles were stuck into strawberries. That's an example of why we need a food defence plan. Whereas in other situations, food might be used as a substitute from the real food. For instance, horse meat might be used to be sold into the UK as meat from cows. So it's obviously cheaper, and they're trying to get an economical gain through that food fraud. So that's the difference really between food defence and food fraud. So we now require for FSSC 22000 a food defence plan. And we've got to start off with a threat assessment, and examples of tools to do that include HACCP, and I'll talk about HACCP in a minute. Carver and Shock is another one. The FDA's own Food Defence Plan Builder is another one. There are a myriad of them. But somehow identify what the threats are for a ideologically driven adulteration of your food products. And then develop a plan based on that, identifying the mitigation measures that you're going to take to stop it happening, and verification, what verification you have in place to ensure that it isn't happening, and management procedures for if the incidents do occur. In a food fraud vulnerability plan, similar. We need to do an assessment. And examples of tools like that we can use are FSSC, which I'll talk about in a minute, or there's an SSAFE program as well. SSAFE was originally started by PricewaterhouseCoopers in the early days of when this was all coming about as a means for people to do this assessment. And then at the end of it, once you understand what the threats are, you develop a food fraud vulnerability or mitigation plan to identify the controls you have in place. I talked about HACCP and FSSC. What's that mean? Well, these terms have come about as a means to identify how you can address these threats. HACCP stands for Threat Assessment and Critical Control Points, to be used when you're developing a food defence plan. FSSC is about vulnerability assessment and critical control points, to be used for a food fraud plan. They use the same methodology as HACCP in that they require a control plan for mitigating the threats, monitoring and having corrections there ready to go should something happen. So it's the same philosophy as HACCP. And so what we're finding in many organisations, they're using these means to identify the threats because people are common, they understand the methodology of HACCP anyway. Some of those other systems or tools that I spoke of before can be quite complex. So we've talked about food defence plans, food fraud vulnerability plans, we've talked about the hazard control plans. There's two other plans that's required for FSSC 22000. An Allergen plan is the first of those two. And this is where organisations must have a documented allergen management plan, which includes a risk assessment covering all the potential sources of allergens for cross-contamination of your food products, and then have control measures in place to reduce or eliminate those risks of cross-contamination. So we can all think about whether the food bench where you're preparing food, if we put meat on it and don't clean it afterwards and then prepare the salad on it, clearly there can be cross-contamination. In food manufacturing processes, some of those problems can be quite difficult to monitor. So it's all about the risk of your business when you're determining the allergen plan. And the other plan is the environmental monitoring plan, which is a bit like the verification plan. It's organisations must have a risk-based environmental management plan, so it's got to be risk-based, for evaluating the effectiveness of all controls on preventing contamination for the manufacturing environment. Must include as a minimum the evaluation of microbiological and allergen controls present, and data of the monitoring activities, including regular trends and analysis. Organisations must have that data available. So that's the environmental monitoring plan. So you can see as we're coming along here that there are a number of extra requirements for FSSC 22000. Essentially, they're all about the risk, and so essentially it's a body of work that's done up front. Once it's done up front, you can then achieve certification, and it's just a matter of monitoring those plans. There's a little extra work in actually what you're doing as time marches on. There's not a lot of extra work because of these plans, but you do monitor them, and your ability to react to issues as they come along is the important thing. So if you wanted to achieve certification from ISO 22000 to FSC 22000, indeed, if you're transitioning from ISO 22000 or any other GFSI standard, you don't have to go through the startup process of a stage 1 and stage 2 audit. All you need to do is undertake an audit, the duration of which would be the same for a recertification audit. So it's not a lot of extra time for the auditors. And the rationale for that, I suppose, is that it's really a paper-based exercise. If you're transitioning from the old version 4.1 of FSSC 22000 to the new version 5, it simply needs to be done at the next scheduled audit in 2020. So by the end of 2020, all version 4.1 FSSC certifications should have transitioned to version 5 anyway. You have no choice. The good thing about that, though, is in a transition audit, they can't be unannounced. So they will be announced. You will know that they're happening. So we're drawing to the close of our webinar, but let me just run a little video we have here about how TQCSI could assist in that process.
FSSC 22000 is a certification scheme recognised by GFSI, the Global Food Safety Initiative, providing worldwide recognition to food and beverage companies. This global scheme approaches food safety by identifying risks and having controls in place to prevent their occurrence. An increasing number of manufacturers and retailers require their suppliers to be certified to this international standard. If your company has HACCP or ISO 22000 in place, you can transition to FSSC 22000. This scheme requires a food safety management system which includes ISO 22000, a prerequisite program, PRP, for your sector, and some additional requirements. With more than 30 years certification experience globally, TQCSI audits and certifies organisations to HACCP, ISO 22000, FSSC 22000, and many other ISO management system standards. Ask us about FSSC 22000 today and get your products ready to enter markets all around the world.
So that's the end of the webinar. I hope it has given you some thoughts about how you would progress to FSSC 22000 certification. Thank you for your time and good food safety.